What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? One day as a kid I was exploring the forests near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill, but there were several craters there because of bombs that were dropped there during the World Wars. Germany. One day we saw a backpack at the bottom of one. We tried to climb down, but it was kinda steep and slippery, so we didn't want to risk falling. We planned on returning later with a rope and went home. The next day news story was that there was a backpack found with the remains of a girl in that forest. A guy walking his dog found it after the dog wouldn't stop barking and going crazy at the edge of the crater while staring at the backpack. We stopped exploring the forests after. You just got saved from being haunted by a memory for your whole f***ing life. So grateful for that. The bag even looked like it hasn't been there that long. Still looked new. That's why we wanted to get it. We thought that maybe someone accidentally dropped it in there. To think that the person that dumped it there could have been still nearby. That person could have been watching you, waiting for you to disturb the backpack, or perhaps stop you before you made a successful attempt. I'd rather not think about that too much. We could have been the next ones down there. So disturbing. I was a director of my college's student government. There was this dude who was always willing to take on projects, so I gave him lots of stuff. I remember thinking he was very charismatic and well dressed, and when he told me he owned a startup clothing company, I bought some stuff from his website. It was typical for student government kids to end up at the same parties, and I ran into him several times outside of committee. I was studying abroad my senior year, and I was here on Reddit. Saw an article with the guy's face on it. Turns out he RD 12 girls at my university. It was apparently well known, but because his father was a dean, it kept getting swept under the rug. Apparently he was using extracurriculars like the student government to keep coming back to campus after he had been removed from his class. I always wondered WTF the parents must be thinking knowing their children are doing this shit. My grandparents were like those parents. They adopted an infant who turned into a full BLWN sociopath. Nature or nurture, probably both. He showed cleric signs as a kid. My mom was 13 years older and remembers a lot of what he did. Cruelty to animals. Eventually and child molestation. In and out of jail his whole life, very unlike all his female siblings. My grandparents dealt with a lot of thing by denial. They never corrected his antisocial behavior as a child, saying boys will be boys and shrugging it off. Makes me furious that so many of his victims could have been spared if they actually took responsibility as parents. Anyway, he was out of jail one time and came to visit my parents. I was an infant and the first grandchild. He stole my father's rifle that was over the mantle. My mom told her parents. It all came out to my mom that he had a history of molesting children, which she hadn't known. My mom was livid, asking her parents how they could not have told her when she now has a child. They responded that they thought he was over all that now, i.e. not doing it anymore. My guess is they thought that BC he told them that in one of his many successful attempts to get money from them. So my mom estranged herself from him, never to see him again. To me, that's a no-brainer. He posed a danger to her children, but the rest of the family ostracized her for it, saying you should always stick with family, never mind that her children. Me and my later siblings were her family. My mom's a ref-king hero for that emo, and her family were always JRKS to her. How dare you not bring your child around the child molester? That's clearly worse. Humans are ref-king NTS. When I worked in healthcare I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics. People. This happened to a colleague. Except he lay for 4 days semi-conscious on the floor of his house until another colleague went to look for him. He very nearly died. That is terrifying. Good on your other colleague for going to check on him. Man. Now I have a new fear. One of my dad's friend's wife was murdered by some crazy dude walking down the street. This guy had just been released from a mental hospital and literally just stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend came back, he thought she had just taken the dogs out for a walk, so he walked along the normal walk route and he saw loads of blue lights. He was stopped by a police officer and wasn't allowed any closer until he saw that it was his wife. What exactly is the protocol there with police officers? Is it just Spider-Man rules, where you just have to keep trying to get a peek until you can recognize them? I was walking down the street years ago and saw a cop standing on the path who started asking me how my day was and trying to make conversation as I got closer to him. Turns out my neighbor was dead on his front lawn and the cop was trying to distract me from seeing the body. The neighbor had only died of a heart attack, and I'm not shocked by death, so I just kept walking past. The cop didn't try to stop me or anything. He just asked, "Are you going to be alright?" Or, "What a nice dude." He cold said nothing, but he wanted to make sure you'd be okay. Yay. He seems like a good guy. Some people can get really distressed the first time they see a dead body, especially if it's someone you knew. It's one of the reasons I think it's important to take kids to funerals. Maybe a really rough one you should avoid, but taking kids to funerals for people who die of old age, where it's more of a celebration of life than a time of mourning, is a good thing to do. It eases them into it, so that when the time comes for a really rough one they won't be completely blindsided by the process. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s, during her first semester at college. They were lab partners, and mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out. But she said if he'd asked her out, she went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that, since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other class, the library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off because you guys are dating. Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that, but it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work and grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in because he looked rather sad. He starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified grandma. "Well, ma'am, I just got back from overseas and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide, but he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing, and this didn't win him too many friends. So it's anyone's guess who he might have PSS'd off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly, like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. If you have the details correct, I don't see how the stalker didn't get done by his own guys for something that happened. When I was young, I saw a documentary about a guy who got flesh-eating bacteria in his nasal cavity. It ate his face, and he's still alive. Eventually they removed the bacteria by removing the eaten parts of his face. He got a prosthetic face, which back in those days was basically a plastic Halloween mask that tried to look human. At the end of the documentary, He took the mask off. His face from his forehead down to his mouth was just a hole. Well, I didn't need sleep tonight.